Today we're going to discuss the armies of 9th edition 40k and which ones I think are the strongest. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. So 9th edition has been out for a little while now, and people have had a bit of a chance to put together the combos and synergies with the new rules and see what sort of things work and what doesn't. Admittedly, there still haven't been all that many events with decent numbers to truly establish what are the very top dogs and which armies are struggling a bit, but I think there's been enough information out there now to draw some early conclusions as to what sort of things are looking strong. With that in mind, I thought I'd break down my own thoughts as to what sort of armies are going to be the strongest in 40k into a rough tier list, and I've decided to array the various armies into 5 different tiers, starting with the weakest on tier 5 and moving up to the strongest on tier 1. Now I know everyone has their own opinions as to what's strong in the game, and these tier lists are always a little bit controversial. This is just my rough best guess at the moment, so it's up to you whether you find it helpful or not. If you think that I've ranked anything too high or too low, please let us know. It'd be interesting to hear your insights on your army that you're most familiar with yourself. In any case, let's jump right into it, and we'll start with tier 5. Now I'd just like to say that even the ones that I think are the weakest in 40k at the moment aren't necessarily impossible to win games with. There are quite a few routes to victory in 9th edition by picking up certain special secondary objectives, or playing intelligently for board control, but I do think that these guys might give you a bit more of a challenge. First up we have Chaos Demons. They've been hit repeatedly by heavy nerfs over the course of 8th edition, and weren't all that strong going into it, only having received a fairly mediocre Psychic Awakening update that only buffed certain aspects of their army. On top of that, the 8th edition Coherency and Blast rules really punish the large units that they often like to run, which certainly hasn't helped them taking any sort of horde approach. It's not to say that they're not without strength. Nurglings are absolutely excellent as a unit, really good for screening and scoring early points. You can tool up several of the greater demons to be really quite scary with their new exalted abilities, and there is still a lot to be said for big hordes of durable obsec infantry, such as Plague Bearers or maybe even Demonettes with their relatively cheaper points now. However, I just feel that they lack a fair bit of the raw hitting power of some of the other armies, and are in a bit of a rough spot right now. Next we have the Necrons, who despite their massive influx of new units from the Indomitors box, I still don't think are looking all that strong. The main reason I've placed them here is that they didn't really receive anything in the way of a Psychic Awakening update, and their codex wasn't particularly strong throughout 8th edition, being ranked some of the weakest I think. The new units from Indomitors are helpful, though not absolutely bananas strong like a few of the Space Marine options, and I think really at this point we're going to have to wait and see what their new codex brings. I'm sure it will bring a decent power boost, but until then they really remain one of the more challenging options to win with. Finally, in the lower tier I've included Genestealer cults, who really got hit very hard indeed with a lot of the points changes, already again being somewhat on the back foot in 8th edition. The command point change didn't really help them much, seeing as they were usually able to run multiple battalions already. Unit coherency changes didn't help, and some of their hardest hitting units are just incredibly expensive to field now. They still have a fair few tricks and shenanigans that could be used to intelligently win some points, but I feel like they're always going to have a bit of an uphill struggle just because they're lacking a bit in raw strength, and I'm not sure that their tricks are currently making up for that at the moment. Next up we come to the 4th tier, perhaps a little bit stronger but not ones that I think we're likely to see top in tournaments too regularly. First up we have Imperial and Chaos Knights that didn't do too badly out of the points changes, but I just think that the 9th missions really don't help them all that much, and their Psychic Awakening updates didn't really add too much in terms of power. In general, I think they're not too bad in terms of raw power and killing the opponent off the table, but with 9th edition secondary missions that's not always all that important. They're quite easy to win secondary points against with Titan Slayers, and they're not all that good at taking and holding objectives. Potentially could be a powerful beatdown element of an otherwise soups list, but they do have quite a lot of weaknesses when taken in a large force. Next we have Drukhari, who were really hit very heavily indeed in terms of points changes going from 8th to 9th. With unfortunate changes to things like disintegrators and some of their core troops going up in cost. Generally a bit more of a challenge to win with, though for objective related games they could still be a challenge to deal with for some armies, just due to their sheer mobility and being able to put obsec units across the board pretty fast. Talos units could also still be a pretty decent option in terms of bullying their way towards the centre of the board. Next we have Orcs, which I was debating putting in tier 3 or tier 4, and I could have happily put them in either really. In general, the changes from 8th to 9th really haven't been kind to them at all. Hordes nerfed, Vigilus detachments removed from competitive play, and many of their most important options going up in points significantly. An Orc list did top a tournament recently, although since then Games Workshop also seems to have removed the Warboss on Warbike from competitive play. which was a really quite important part of said list. Despite their challenges, I could still see orcs being a bit of a force to be reckoned with on the table. Admittedly, their hordes aren't quite as dangerous as they were before, but still having to peel them off the objective after they've jumped across the board could be very annoying. And they do have some decent firepower options in their ever-reliable smasher guns, or decent firepower units such as Megatrack scrapjets or Death Dreads when they're outfitted with custom jobs. So definitely got some challenges, but they do have their own strengths in the new edition. Thousand Suns have some of their own challenges in 9th, particularly with their multicast smites being nerfed heavily, and also not being able to fall back and cast psychic powers anymore. I think Thousand Suns lists in 9th edition will be revolving a lot more around Rubric Marines, just due to the points increases on Zangors and Cultists, and a decent amount of synergy that they got for them in their Psychic Awakening book Ritual of the Damned. In terms of more competitive play though, I'm just not convinced that they'll do better than the armies such as Death Guard, in terms of a slow moving force that's grinding down the enemy gradually, with Rubric Marine shooting and psychic powers. Next up we have Astra Militarum, who also have seen some pretty hefty points bumps, including their infantry squads going from 4 to 5 points, and some fairly painful increases on the Lehman Ross battle tank. In terms of raw damage output and durability, I feel they might struggle just a little bit compared with armies that are higher on this list, and they can be fairly easy to score secondary points against, either via foot guards giving up easy points for killing hordes, or their vehicles allowing you to get the secondaries from killing tanks. I think future Astra Militarum lists might be cutting down on the infantry a little bit and focusing more on the Lehman Ross tanks and artillery, particularly on demolisher-toting tank commanders. Despite their points increase and some of the downsides of having 10-man units, just due to their sheer amount of movement that they can get via move, jumping onto objectives or scoring secondaries such as engage on all fronts. Finally for tier 4 we have the Tyranids, who I still think are going to be a challenge to win with going from 8th to 9th, as they weren't all really that strong in the previous edition. I think we're still going to see fairly similar lists for them, particularly building things around units such as Hive Guard and Exocrines, and some Rippers to sneak some secondary objectives. It's a bit of a shame that Genestealers took a fairly big points hike, going up from 12 to 15, which doesn't help one of their most competitive builds, which was slinging them forward with the Swarmlord. Moving on to tier 3 next, and here we have the Sisters of Battle, the Death Watch, Chaos Space Marines, Tau, Harlequins and Craftworlds. Firstly, I think that the Sisters are in a fairly good spot at the moment, as the new Eternal War missions fit quite well into what they already wanted to do, which was lining up a decent amount of bolter-armed bodies on a battle line, with some powerful countercharge units such as Repentia or maybe Penitent Engines now. They look like they're only set to get stronger as well, with buffs incoming for Flamers and Melter weapons, so could really have quite a decent buff to their range potential after the FAQ. Next I chose to include Death Watch here, who I think do what they do very well indeed, which is jumping in and mowing down a whole load of enemy infantry with those excellent special issue ammunition shots. Their White Dwarf update was good if a little bit boring, just gaining combat doctrines really made them a lot more efficient at doing what they were already fairly good at. I've chosen to rank them a little bit lower than some of the other Space Marine chapters, just as they're a little bit limited in terms of their war gear at the moment, but with rolling them into the main Space Marine Codex and accessing all of those new Indomitus units, including the Eradicators to fill their anti-tank niche, could make them legitimately scary in the future. Right now though, they do seem pretty efficient for an allied choice to cover some deep strike damage dealing to infantry. Next I put Codex Chaos Space Marines here, who I'll admit haven't really been helped too much by the points changes or the rules changes going into 9th, particularly breaking some of their super synergies by getting minus loads to hit on one unit. However, with things like Defilers getting a bit cheaper relatively, a ton of good synergy around Demon Engines, and all manner of sneaky tricks that you can use depending on the Chaos Codex, particularly scary things including Alpha Legion being able to prevent shooting at a unit, and pre-game moving towards objectives, do mean that I think that Chaos Marines can perform pretty well if they're in the hands of someone who knows them well. Next up we have Tau, who have been reasonably strong in 8th, but haven't been treated amazingly well from the change from 8th to 9th. Shield drones went up massively in cost, which was one of their units they really relied on to keep their battlesuits alive. Changes to fly mean they can't fall back and shoot with units like Riptides and Crisis suits, and a lot of the missions involve bullying your way to the centre of the table and sitting on objectives, which Tau will struggle to do as a more gunline focused faction that doesn't really want to be exposing themselves to close combat. Getting free army-wide Overwatch is a very nice ability, don't get me wrong, and it can still bring some very, very scary shooting to just blow their enemy away, but whether or not it actually allows them to win the game might be another matter. Finally we have Harlequins and Craftworld Eldar. Harlequins are I think a little bit like the Death Watch, a bit limited in terms of their faction options, but they bring some really strong tools to the table now. Their White Dwarf Psychic Awakening update added a whole load of buffs to their unique characters, including scary things for the Death Jester and Shadowseer, as well as a bunch of really useful stratagems that can absolutely mess with your opponent's movement and have things jumping in and out of combat and then jumping back to safety. I think a pure Harlequin's army is still going to be a bit limited, but I think they could be a very strong ally for either the Craft Worlds or the Drukhari. Speaking of which, Craft Worlds I think are an army that has potentially been knocked off its perch a bit more by going from 8th to 9th. Several units took some very punishing points increases, plus again changes to the fly special rule isn't great for their shooting platforms. I think they can still be very scary with certain movement abilities like Quicken with their psychic powers, and combining things like Doom and Jinx to really amp up shooting to delete one unit. So I still think that they can be effective, but again maybe just a bit more high level skill than before. The removal of their flyer wing detachment has also pretty much killed one of their stronger builds in the Eldar Air Force, which already seemed to be on its way out anyway, but it's really not so great with the 9th missions either. Moving on, we have Tier 2, and here I've placed the Blood Angels, Dark Angels and Space Wolves, also Death Guard, Admech, Adeptus Custodes and Grey Knights. In my estimations it's looking just a little bit Imperium heavy at the top. First up, I've included Blood Angels, Dark Angels and Space Wolves as having access to an absolute ton of scary Space Marine options and having their own unique flavours on them, but their own unique limitations as well. They're all due to be part of the main Codex Space Marines when it comes out, so that might be a power buff to them when they get it, but even before then I think that they're still very scary. Being able to throw scary melee units in the enemy's face as fast as possible is great for the Blood Angels and Space Wolves. It really helps with messing with the primary objective scoring, and even if they are wiped out, it might have meant they've had a fair bit of objective scoring for the first few turns anyway. Dark Angels can have a very scary build centered around Azrael for the 4+ invul save on nearby infantry, which is pretty solid on units like Aggressors or Eradicators for example, and should be getting even more scary with reworked chapter tactics and also what looks like a buff to Hellblasters coming in new Codex Space Marines. Space Wolves are going to profit from the close combat abilities much like Blood Angels. Of course they're a little bit slower, but potentially a bit more durable with units like Wolven with Storm Shields. I think that Wolfguard Terminators will be quite successful for them at the moment as well as the very undercosted Stormfang gunship, which I think that Games Workshop made a copy-paste error when translating it into their new edition, which is now very, very cheap for what it does. Next up, I've placed the Death Guard here, who are an incredibly durable army, which 9th edition just seems to have worked out for incredibly well. Their Psychic Awakening content gave them an absolute ton of decent stratagems to use, particularly effective on large numbers of Plague Marines, and the changes to how army construction is done means that they can easily get max amount of command points. One of their Plague companies can allow their Demon Engines to get a 4+ invul save as well, which can make them near impossible to shift efficiently, and in a game that's all about taking and holding objectives, these guys have got you covered. Next up we have the Adeptus Mechanicus, who have taken a few hits going from 8th to 9th, but it doesn't take away from the fact that they've had a very nice power boost in terms of a few new units, and also loads of different options from Engine War. They can make some very scary shooting castles by stacking Call's rerolls with the Mars +1 strength to heavy weapons buff, and a Holy Order Warlord trait that allows exploding 6s, which can make units like Dune Striders, Castellan Robots, or Iron Striders just ridiculously efficient in terms of removing the enemy. With units like Cerberus Raiders to take the midfield and push on the enemy, and also Cataphrone Breachers to hold objectives, they're looking pretty strong going into 9th. Finally, we have sort of two sides of the same coin in Adeptus Custodes and Grey Knights. Both of these guys were really struggling in 8th, and then received some significant buffs from Psychic Awakening, and then 9th edition kind of doubled down on this by making durable elite infantry armies just that bit more scary, particularly when you have to try and go to them to steal their objectives. Grey Knights can have a ton of synergy with their Tides of the Warp and jumping big units of paladins around, and Adeptus Custodes can achieve some very similar big synergies with units such as Alaris Custodians. I think that both armies still certainly have their challenges, but can cause very big problems for the opponent. Finally, we come to Tier 1, and I've only chosen to put one army in this tier, who are of course your standard Space Marines. I think now a lot of Space Marine strength is actually just coming from their core units and their stat lines and points costs, particularly the new Eradicators, who are just crazy efficient, Grav Devastators, who are cheap and pretty murderous, and the Relic Contemptor Dreadnought, which is just very durable and very damaging at range. Space Marines of course have a ton of different options, and it's looking like Salamanders might now be the current Space Marine faction to beat. They really come into their own with the buff to the melter weapons of the Eradicators, plus the Strategic Reserve special rules, which can allow them to get their very durable and hard-hitting units right into the enemy's face. Otherwise, I think the White Scars are very strong indeed, and are going to particularly enjoy the Primaris Outriders, and I still think that Iron Hands are very scary to face, probably more so for their very durable infantry build, along with Iron Father Phyros and the Chief Apothecary, giving them the 5+ Invul and 5+ Feel No Pain. Plus they have some good synergy with vehicles, and there are a lot of strong ones of those running around in the Space Marine arsenal at the moment. It'll be interesting to see if they retain their crown after their new codex comes out. It's going to be interesting to see if their points costs are still reflective of what they have at the moment, or whether they're going to be brought back into balance somewhat. So as I said, I know these tier lists are very subjective, and if you think I've ranked any armies too high or too low, please let me know and why down in the comments below. I'm sure as we continue to see tournament results start to trickle in, we'll get a better idea of what sort of things are effective. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics for more similar videos like this. And if you have been watching my content a lot, I'd just like to mention that I do have a Patreon page, which is what allows these videos to keep on coming quite so regularly. If you are enjoying, then any support is appreciated. Channel patrons get to see a video early each week, there's regular votes to see what sort of things I cover next on the channel, and you also get automatically entered into the channel's prize giveaway, which happens once a month. The one at the start of September will be for 4 copies of the Elite Starter Set. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.